Territorial dimensions of politics. We're looking at your first subsection of the concepts of political power and territoriality. The question says, define nation, electoral geography, shatter belt, heartland rimland, and territoriality. First, I want to look at defining what a nation is. A nation is a population that is represented by a singular culture. It's revolving around one particular group of people. That's what this nation is set up around, a similar or singular culture. Nations can then go and add more cultures, but at the beginning, nations are represented by a singular culture. Second definition, electoral geography. Electoral geography is the study of the interactions among space, place, and region in the conduct and results of elections. You're looking at the electoral process, you're looking at why people are being elected, where they are geographically, and that's what you're studying. Electoral geography fits best with a democratic nation. Next, describe what a shatter belt is, or define what a shatter belt is. Remember, a shatter belt were these areas in the world that there's consistent fighting going on. In Southeast Asia, this used to be a shatter belt. Today, definitely the Middle East area is a shatter belt. This is an area with consistent fighting that goes on, that doesn't stop. And it's just an instability between regions that have opposing political and cultural values. Next, we have the heartland and the rimland theory. The heartland and the rimland theory, remember, regarding the map at the bottom, the idea is if you control the heartland, you can then control the rimland, which if you control the rimland, you can then control this world island, which is all this stuff on the outside of the heartland-rimland theory. One thing that I do want to point out to you in regards to this is this pivot area right here. This pivot area is in Eastern Europe as well as Siberia, and this pivot area is here, and the reason that it's vital is because of resources. If you control the pivot area, you have resources which you can then use to control the rimland region. And then if you control the rimland region, you have access to the coast where you can get out to the world island region. Okay, this was a theory that was developed. Remember, Hitler took this geopolitical theory to heart in creating his geographic areas and his geographic boundaries. Next says, what type of government would electoral geography fit best in? And I've already answered that once, but that's a democratic type of government. Next is referring to the law of the sea. Remember, the law of the sea gives countries 12 nautical miles of sovereignty in regards to their control of the coast. In other words, they have 12 nautical miles on the outside of their country into the sea in which they control, that other nations can't then come in and control. They have economic control over these areas. And I forgot one of the definitions of territoriality. Territoriality is referring to the practice of creating geographic boundaries in response to social and political conditions, and it typically acts to separate different populations by their culture. Going back to that original definition of nation. Going back to the heartland and rimland theory now with the nature, meaning, and function of boundaries. The question is, why is the pivot area of the heartland-rimland theory so important? Remember, this is going back to the idea that this pivot area has resources. This pivot area is in Eastern Europe as well as in Siberia, in the regions of Russia. It goes back to the resources. Next says, list the physical geographic boundaries, what those may be. Remember, physical geographic boundaries may be things like rivers, maybe things like mountains, maybe things like deserts, oceans, physical features that could define a boundary. Remember, Eastern Africa is a great example of using water as a physical boundary because a lot of these areas have rivers that are separating them. Next question says, list the most common geometric political boundary. Should be very easy. That is a straight line. When you see straight lines in regards to geometric, or in regards to boundaries, these are a geometric boundary. Next, number 3 is looking at the influences of boundaries on identity, interaction, and exchange. Looking at definitions here, the first is to define nationalism. Nationalism is the strong desire for a nation. Okay, nationalism is the idea that you support your nation and that you are strongly reflecting that in all of your actions. Now, there's 2 types of forces in regards to nationalism. One is centrifugal forces. Centrifugal forces are forces that are seeking to destroy or tear apart the nation state, or the state, not necessarily nation state. Centripetal forces are forces that are wanting to keep the state together, not wanting to destroy or separate the area. The last definition in regards to this is a buffer state. A buffer state is a state that lies between 2 states that are generally more powerful, but this location of this state acts to balance the power between these 2, which in most cases would not like each other. So you have this buffer zone in the middle to make them like each other, to keep them away from each other. Subsection number 4, federal and unitary states, confederations, centralized government, and forms of governance. Got 2 definitions I want to identify. First is unitary. A unitary is looking at a local form of government that leaves power in the hands of a centralized government. In other words, it is local, but we're still keeping it in the hands of a centralized government, meaning in the hands of the major national government. This works well in cases like France, when predominantly you have one culture group that is okay with this centralized government being in control. But in a lot of areas, there's force behind this. In certain places in Africa, this is going on, but the people are not happy about it because they're just forcing this nation or this culture on the other peoples. The next is looking at federal state, and I wrote Africa in red. Disregard that. Federal state is also looking at a local type of government, but a federal state gives power to local regional governments. This works best in large nations, also works best in diverse nations, because each of these ethnicities can be represented with your regional type of government. Second part of that question says, where would a confederacy likely arise in regards to these 2 types of government systems? And a confederacy is more likely going to arise from a federal government because you have things that give local power, like these regional types of governments where there's already people in power locally. And so it's easy for them to kind of break away and create their own governments, for example, like the American Civil War. The next says, list the hierarchy of political units starting with the largest power. In other words, just ideas about how you group political units. What would be the largest? If we were to do that, it would start with an empire. It would then go down to a nation state. It would then go down to something like a province or a country, or a state, a province or a state like Texas, Oklahoma, those types of states. Then it would go down to county, and you can even break it down to city, and then you could even go down further into different aspects or different geographic areas in that city. Next question says, describe a federal system. Remember, a federal system is one that uses checks and balances. A federal system works best with diverse nations. It works best with large nations. It works best with those that have populations that have a bunch of different cultures in them. But it all takes checks and balances into play because then these local regional governments check the power of the larger national governments. Last part of this question says, what 2 continents house most of the world's unitary states? Remember, unitary states are when a country controls the local areas as well as the national levels where they force them. The 2 major continents that this is located is Africa and Asia. These are the areas where you're going to find most of your unitary governments, and a lot of these unitary governments are not because people necessarily want them, it's because these governments are just controlling the area. Next question is the spatial relationship between political systems and ethnicity, economy, and gender. What I want to look at here is fragmentation. We're going to be defining fragmentation. Fragmentation is the breaking off and leaving of an ethnic group. What this does is borders sometimes create differences between ethnicities, and then these ethnicities then want to break off and fragment away and create their own nation. A good example of that is Russia. Russia is a huge multinational, multicultural nation, and if every single one of these different ethnic groups were to break away, Russia would then be fragmented because these ethnic groups would break away and then create their own nation, which would fragment the nation of Russia. And again, sometimes when you put borders in between these ethnicities, that's not really the best thing to do. Like the Turkmen people, well, with Turkey, you put a border here between them, and fragmentation is likely going to occur if they are near those areas. Next is looking at the nation-state concept. The first thing that I want you to do is to define what a nation-state is. A nation-state is a nation constructed around one shared ethnicity, one common ethnicity. For example, going back to that Russia example, if the Tatars were to break away and create their own nation around their Tatar ethnicity, then that would give them a nation-state. This would be referred to as ethnic homogeneity, meaning one ethnicity in the area, one ethnicity that is controlling the area. That's what ethnic homogeneity is looking at. Ethnic homogeneity would be a great example of a nation-state. The next is just looking at the definition of a state. A state is main purpose is a population, and it's defined by an area that's controlled and organized by a government. That's when a government comes in and controls it. Next question, what is the government required to do in a nation or in a state? Main thing or two main principles that a government is required to do is to protect its borders and then to resolve any internal conflict. Two of the main goals or issues that a government must face. Then we're looking at how to explain the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia most heavily influenced the development of a nation-state because this was after Napoleon. The areas involved had to redraw Europe's boundaries or redraw Europe's borders because Napoleon had controlled the region. And they did so based off of shared languages, which is an idea of a nation-state because you have one ethnicity that has a language and they redrew country borders based off of these languages.